Sometimes, the loneliest moments in life come just before everything changes forever. For Gideon Pike, a weathered mountain man who'd chosen solitude over the pain of losing people he loved, that moment came when he found a dying woman in the desert sand. She had 3 arrows in her back and was clutching a blood-soaked pouch like it held her very soul. "Please, don't touch it," she whispered. But his wolf knocked the pouch open anyway. What fell out wasn't treasure. It was a twisted charm made of bone and hair that felt ancient and wrong. That night, voices started riding the desert wind. Voices from Gideon's past that he'd spent years trying to forget. The woman lived, but something else awakened too. Now the land itself seemed to be rotting around them. What was in that cursed charm, and why did it feel like his buried secrets were crawling back to destroy him? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The high desert of Montana had a way of making a man face his demons, whether he wanted to or not. Gideon Pike had learned that lesson the hard way over the past 3 years, ever since he'd walked away from everything that resembled civilization and made these unforgiving mountains his home. The silence out here wasn't peaceful, it was demanding. It asked questions a man didn't want to answer and served up memories he'd rather leave buried. This morning started like every other for the past 1,000 mornings. Before dawn broke over the jagged peaks that surrounded his valley, Gideon was already up, checking his trap lines with Echo padding silently beside him. The wolf, though Gideon suspected Echo had more dog in him than he let on, had been his only companion since that first winter when the animal had simply appeared at his cabin door. Half-starved and looking as lost as Gideon felt, the trapping knife hanging from Gideon's belt had belonged to his father, and his father's father before that. The bone handle was worn smooth from decades of use, and the blade held its edge despite the countless times it had been honed against the whetstone back at the cabin. Working these mountains with his father's tools felt like keeping faith with something larger than himself, even when faith seemed like a luxury he couldn't afford. Echo's ears pricked forward as they approached the North Ridge trapline. The wolf's hackles rose slightly, and he let out a low whine that Gideon had learned to interpret as unease. In 3 years of running these hills together, Echo had never steered him wrong when it came to sensing trouble. The animal had an uncanny ability to read the land's moods, to know when something didn't belong. That's when Gideon saw her. The woman lay crumpled in a shallow depression between 2 boulders, her dark hair matted with blood and sand. 3 arrows protruded from her back, at angles that suggested she'd been running when they struck. Her clothes, what remained of them, marked her as a traveler, not local. Leather riding skirt, cotton blouse, now torn and stained, boots made for long distances rather than mountain work. But it was her hands that caught Gideon's attention. Even unconscious, even barely breathing, she clutched a small leather pouch against her chest with both fists. Her knuckles were white with the strain of holding on, as if letting go meant death itself. "Easy there," Gideon murmured, kneeling beside her. Her pulse was weak but steady, her breathing shallow but regular. The arrows had missed anything vital, though she'd lost enough blood to paint the sand dark around her. He'd seen worse wounds in his military days, men who'd walked away from injuries that should have killed them. This woman had fight in her yet. Echo circled them both, whining softly. The wolf's behavior struck Gideon as odd. Not protective exactly, but wary. Like he recognized something about the woman that Gideon couldn't see. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Her eyes fluttered open, revealing irises the color of storm clouds. "Don't touch it." She was looking at the pouch pressed against her chest, her fingers tightening around it, despite her weakness. Gideon had no idea what it was, but the terror in her voice was real enough. He'd heard that same tone from dying soldiers who'd seen things that didn't belong in the waking world. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said, keeping his voice low and steady. "But we need to get you to my cabin. Those arrows need to come out, and you need water and rest." She tried to shake her head, but the movement sent a spasm of pain across her face. "They're coming," she managed. "The brothers." They want what's mine, brothers. That could mean anything. Siblings, fellow travelers, members of some religious group. But the way she said it like a curse word suggested something darker. Echo's growling grew more pronounced, and Gideon found himself scanning the horizon for riders. The woman, he guessed her age at somewhere near 40, though pain and exhaustion made it hard to tell, had the weathered hands of someone who'd worked hard all her life. A simple gold band on her ring finger caught the morning light. Married then, though no husband had come looking for her yet? "What's your name?" Gideon asked, as he carefully slipped his arms under her shoulders and knees. She was lighter than expected, as if the desert had already begun claiming its due. "Martha," she whispered. Martha Crenshaw. The name meant nothing to him, but names rarely did anymore. Out here in the high country, a person's past mattered less than their present, and their present less than their will to survive another day. Echo led the way back toward the cabin, occasionally looking over his shoulder as if checking to make sure they weren't being followed. The wolf's behavior troubled Gideon more than he wanted to admit. In 3 years, Echo had never shown fear of anything. Not mountain lions, not bears, not the worst storms these peaks could deliver. Whatever had this woman running, scared, had his wolf on edge too. The cabin sat in a natural clearing halfway up the south face of Devil's Crown Peak. Gideon had built it himself, using timber from dead lodgepole pines and fieldstone gathered from the valley floor. It wasn't much to look at. One room with a stone fireplace, a sleeping loft, and a covered porch that faced east toward the sunrise. But it had weathered 3 Montana winters without complaint. More than he could say for some of the finer houses he'd known in his previous life. Inside, he laid Martha on his own bed and set about building up the fire. The arrows would have to come out, but that meant heated water, clean cloth, and steady hands. He'd performed field surgery before, though never on someone who might be carrying whatever had Echo so spooked. "The pouch," Martha whispered when she saw him preparing his medical kit. "Promise me you won't open it." Gideon paused in his work, studying her face. Fear had carved deep lines around her eyes, but underneath it he saw something else. Determination, maybe, or resignation. The look of someone who'd already accepted that death might be the kindest outcome. "I promise," he said, though the words felt heavier than they should have. As he worked to remove the first arrow, Martha drifted in and out of consciousness. During her lucid moments, she muttered fragments that made little sense. Warnings about sacred ground, apologies to someone named Thomas, and repeated pleas to keep them from completing their work. Viva talk, most likely, but Gideon had learned to listen when people spoke from the edge of death. Sometimes they said things that mattered. Echo refused to come inside while Martha was there. The wolf paced the porch, occasionally letting out low howls that seemed to echo off the surrounding peaks longer than they should have. When Gideon stepped outside to check on him, he found Echo staring not at the cabin, but at something beyond it, something only the wolf could see. "What is it, boy?" Gideon asked, following the wolf's gaze. The valley stretched out below them, empty as always. But the silence felt different somehow, expectant, like the land itself was holding its breath. That night, after he'd removed all 3 arrows and bandaged Martha's wounds as best he could, Gideon sat by the fire and tried to make sense of what had happened. A woman fleeing from people called the Brothers, carrying something she was terrified to let anyone touch. Wounded by arrows in country where most folks carried rifles. It added up to trouble of a kind he'd hoped to leave behind when he'd chosen this hermit's life. Martha's breathing had steadied, and some color had returned to her cheeks. She'd live, barring infection or fever. But as Gideon banked the fire and prepared to sleep on the floor, giving her his bed, he couldn't shake the feeling that saving her life might have doomed them both. Outside, Echo howled again, and this time the sound carried a note Gideon had never heard before. Not warning, not loneliness, but something like sorrow, as if the wolf was mourning something that hadn't died yet, but would soon enough. The leather pouch lay on the table beside Martha's bed, innocent as anything. But when Gideon looked at it directly, shadows seemed to gather at the edges of his vision, and he could have sworn he heard whispers too faint to understand. His father's trapping knife seemed to grow heavier at his belt, as if the old steel remembered other times, other battles against things that shouldn't exist. Before he finally slept, Gideon found himself thinking about the last time he'd made a promise to protect someone. That promise had cost him everything that mattered: his wife Sarah, his daughter Emma, and the life he'd built with them. Now, he'd made another such promise to a stranger, whose very presence had turned his refuge into something that felt like a trap. Some promises, he reflected as sleep finally claimed him, were harder to keep than others. And some, no matter how well-intentioned, came with prices no man should have to pay. Martha woke on the third day with fever-bright eyes and a clarity that hadn't been there before. She sat up in bed despite Gideon's protests, her storm-grey gaze fixing on the leather pouch that still lay untouched on the bedside table. "You kept your word," she said, her voice stronger now, though still rough from her ordeal. "Most men wouldn't have." Gideon was cleaning his father's trapping knife by the fire, the familiar ritual helping to settle his nerves after 3 nights of fitful sleep. Echo had finally come inside that morning, but the wolf remained agitated, pacing from window to door and back again like a sentry expecting attack. "Most men haven't learned the cost of breaking promises," Gideon replied without looking up from his work. The blade gleamed in the firelight, its edge sharp enough to split a hair. "You ready to tell me what I've gotten myself into?" Martha's laugh held no humor. She reached for the simple gold wedding band on her finger, turning it slowly, as if drawing strength from its familiar weight. "My Thomas always said I had a gift for attracting trouble. Never thought he'd turn out to be the prophetic type." "Thomas your husband?" "Was!" The word came out flat final. "The brothers saw to that 6 months ago. Shot him down like a dog when he tried to protect me." Her fingers tightened around the wedding ring until her knuckles went white. "They wanted this." She gestured toward the pouch. "Been in my family for 4 generations. My great-grandmother passed it to my grandmother, who passed it to my mother, who gave it to me on her deathbed." Gideon set down his knife and really looked at her for the first time since she'd awakened. The fever had burned away the last of her weakness, leaving behind something harder. Her eyes held the kind of determination that came from having nothing left to lose. What's so special about it that men would kill for it? Martha was quiet for a long moment, staring out the cabin's single window at the peaks that surrounded them. When she spoke again, her voice carried the weight of old grief. "My great-grandmother was Crow Indian, married a white trapper against her family's wishes, but she never forgot the old ways. This pouch, it's what her people called a soul catcher, used in burial ceremonies to help the dead find peace." She paused, as if the next words were difficult to speak. "But it can do more than that. In the right hands, at the right time, it can call souls back from where they've gone." The fire popped in the silence that followed, sending sparks up the chimney. Outside, Echo whined softly, and Gideon found himself thinking about voices in the wind that shouldn't exist. "And the brothers know this?" "They're not just killers," Martha said. "They're what's left of an old death cult that's been hunting artifacts like this for decades. Their leader calls himself Brother Mordecai, though I suspect that's not the name his mother gave him. He believes that death is just another boundary to be crossed, another territory to be conquered." Her hand moved instinctively toward the pouch, then stopped. "Thomas was one of them once. Before he met me, before he learned there were some prices too high to pay." The pieces were starting to fit together in ways that made Gideon's stomach tighten. "He stole it from them. He saved it from them." "There's a difference." Martha's voice carried fierce pride mixed with old pain. "Thomas died protecting something sacred, something that was never meant to be used the way the brothers want to use it. They want to perform a ritual on the winter solstice. That's less than 2 weeks from now, using the soul catcher to tear open the boundary between life and death permanently." Gideon stood and walked to the window, scanning the valley below for any sign of riders. The landscape looked peaceful enough in the afternoon light, but Echo's continued agitation suggested otherwise. "Why come here? This is about as far from civilization as a person can get." "Because there's a place," Martha said. "About 3 days' ride north of here. Sacred burial ground that my great-grandmother told stories about. She said the spirits there are so strong that the boundary between worlds is thin. If the brothers complete their ritual there, using the soul catcher as a focus, she didn't finish the sentence, but Gideon could imagine the rest. He'd seen enough death in his military days to understand that some boundaries existed for good reasons, and you came here to... what? Hide it, to bury it properly, to let my great-grandmother's spirit rest and make sure the brothers can never use it for their blasphemy. Martha swung her legs over the side of the bed, testing her strength. I knew they were following me, but I hoped I could reach the burial ground before they caught up. Those arrows suggest otherwise. They were closer than I thought. I managed to kill 2 of them before they put me down, but there are more coming. Always more. She stood carefully, one hand pressed against her bandaged ribs. I won't ask you to come with me, Gideon Pike. You've already done more than any stranger had a right to expect. Just give me supplies enough for 3 days and I'll be out of your hair. Gideon turned from the window to study her face. Determination, yes, but also acceptance of what was likely a suicide mission. She knew she wouldn't survive another encounter with the brothers, not in her condition, not alone. But she was willing to die trying because some things mattered more than living. He recognized that look. He'd seen it in the mirror every morning for 3 years. How many brothers are we talking about? Martha blinked in surprise. We? You said there were more coming. How many? She paused, hope and disbelief warring in her expression. Brother Mordecai travels with at least 12 men, killers and fanatics, every one of them. They won't stop until they have the soul catcher or until they're all dead. Then I guess we better make sure it's the latter. Gideon moved to his gun rack and began checking his rifles. His father's old Winchester, the military-issue Springfield he'd carried home from the war, and a newer Remington he'd acquired for hunting big game. All clean already. 3 days to sacred ground, you said? Gideon, you don't understand. These men, they're not ordinary outlaws. They've been touched by whatever dark power they serve. They don't feel pain the way normal men do, don't fear death because they think their master will bring them back. Martha's voice took on an urgent edge, and the closer we get to the burial ground, the stronger that power becomes. Strange things happen. Impossible things. Echo suddenly bolted upright from where he'd been lying by the fire. The wolf's ears flattened against his head, and a growl rumbled deep in his chest. He was staring at the leather pouch on the table, as if it had just moved. Gideon followed the wolf's gaze and felt ice form in his gut. The pouch was exactly where he'd left it, but something was different. The leather seemed darker somehow, and he could have sworn he saw it pulse once, like a heartbeat. It started, Martha whispered. The soul catcher knows we're talking about moving it, about taking it home. She looked at Gideon with eyes that held both gratitude and terror. There's no backing out now. Whether you come with me or not, whether I live or die, this ends at the sacred burial ground. Outside, the wind had picked up, carrying with it the distant sound of hoofbeats. Echo's growl deepened, and his hackles rose until he looked more wolf than dog. They've found us, Martha said unnecessarily. Gideon checked his weapons one more time, then looked at the woman who'd brought death and damnation to his refuge in the mountains. 3 years of peace and solitude, ended by a dying stranger and a cursed artifact that could raise the dead. He thought about his wife, Sarah, and daughter, Emma. Both gone because of choices he'd made, promises he'd failed to keep. Maybe it was time to make different choices. Maybe redemption lay not in hiding from the consequences of the past, but in facing whatever came next, with courage instead of cowardice. Then I reckon it's time to go, he said, shouldering his rifle. Echo, come on, boy. We've got a long ride ahead of us. The hoofbeats were getting closer. They left the cabin through the back window as the hoofbeats grew closer. Gideon carrying his father's brass compass along with their hastily packed supplies. The compass had guided 3 generations of pikemen through these mountains, and its steady needle pointing true north felt like a blessing as they slipped into the pine forest that climbed toward the higher peaks. Martha moved better than Gideon had expected, though he could see the cost in the tightness around her eyes. Pain was an old companion to both of them. his from 3 years of punishing himself with isolation and hard living, hers from fresh wounds and older griefs. Echo ranged ahead, his dark form ghosting between the trees as he scouted their path. "Tell me about your family," Martha said as they paused to rest beside a mountain stream. The water ran clear and cold, fed by snowmelt from the peaks above. "The ones you lost?" Gideon looked up from filling their canteens, surprised by the directness of her question. Most folks who'd lived hard lives learned not to pry into other people's pain. But maybe Martha figured that people facing death together had a right to know each other's stories. "Sarah and Emma," he said after a moment. "My wife and daughter. Emma was 7 when—" He stopped, the familiar tightness in his chest making it hard to breathe. 3 years, and it still felt like yesterday. When what? Martha's voice was gentle but insistent. "When I made a choice that got them killed." The words came out flat, matter-of-fact. He'd practiced saying them in his head so many times that they'd lost their sharp edges, becoming just another fact about himself, like his height or the color of his eyes. "I was leading a patrol in Colorado territory. Apache raiders had been hitting settlements, and we were tracking them through canyon country. Should have turned back when the weather started looking bad, but I was young and proud and thought I knew better than the storm clouds." Martha sat down on a fallen log, her attention focused completely on his words. It had been 3 years since Gideon had told this story to anyone, and he found himself remembering details he'd tried to forget. Flash flood caught us in a narrow canyon. Lost 5 good men in 10 minutes. Swept away like they'd never existed. I made it out because I was lucky, and because Sergeant Murphy pushed me up onto a ledge before the water took him too. Gideon's hands tightened on the canteen. "When I finally got back to Fort Carson, Sarah and Emma were gone. Cholera outbreak while I was chasing ghosts through the desert. If I'd been there, if I'd made the right choice and turned back when I should have—" "You don't know that," Martha interrupted. "Cholera doesn't care if a man's home or away. It takes who it takes." "Maybe, but I wasn't there when they needed me. Sarah died calling my name, and Emma—" His voice broke. "Emma kept asking for her papa until the very end. That's what the neighbors told me. 7 years old and dying, and her papa was off playing soldier in the canyon country." They sat in silence for a while, listening to the stream babble over its rocky bed. Echo appeared from the underbrush, his ears pricked forward in that way that meant he'd found something worth investigating. "I was married young," Martha said eventually. 17 to Thomas's 22. My parents thought I was throwing my life away on a no-account drifter, and for the first few years it looked like they might be right. Thomas had a way of finding trouble, and I had a way of getting him out of it. She pulled the soul catcher's pouch from inside her jacket, holding it carefully as if it might bite. In the afternoon sunlight, the leather looked almost ordinary, just a small bag that might hold coins or tobacco. But Gideon noticed that Echo kept his distance, and shadows seemed to gather around Martha's hands despite the bright day. "We never had children. Not for lack of trying, mind you, but some things just aren't meant to be. Thomas used to say that God had other plans for us, that maybe our purpose was something different than raising babies and working a farm." She smiled sadly. "Turns out he was right, though I doubt either of us imagined it would end like this. What changed him? From being one of the brothers to love." The word came out simple and sure. He met me, and for the first time in his life, he had something. Worth more than power or knowledge or whatever promises Brother Mordecai had made him. The cult teaches that attachment is weakness, that caring for anything more than their cause makes a man vulnerable. Thomas chose vulnerability. He chose me. Gideon found himself thinking about choices, the ones that defined a man, the ones that destroyed him, the ones that offered redemption. He'd made his share of each kind, and he was beginning to understand that this journey might offer him a chance to make one more. "How long were you together?" 15 years. Best and worst 15 years of my life, all rolled together. Martha tucked the pouch back inside her jacket. "Thomas was never an easy man to love, but he was worth the effort. When he died protecting this," she patted the hidden pouch, He told me that some things were worth dying for, and some things were worth living for, and the trick was knowing which was which when the time came. Echo suddenly went rigid. His attention focused on something beyond their hearing. The wolf's posture spoke of immediate danger, and Gideon was on his feet with his rifle in hand before he'd consciously registered the threat. "How close behind us were they?" he whispered. "Closer than I hoped," Martha replied, checking her own pistol. "The brothers aren't ordinary trackers. They have ways of following that don't depend on broken branches and footprints." As if summoned by her words, the forest around them began to change. The afternoon light dimmed despite the clear sky, and the cheerful babbling of the stream took on a discordant note that made Gideon's teeth ache. Shadows moved wrong, stretching toward them instead of away from the sun. "The soul catcher," Martha said, her voice tight with worry. "It's responding to their presence. The closer they get, the stronger its power becomes." Echo let out a low whine and pressed close to Gideon's legs. The wolf was trembling, not with fear, Gideon realized, but with barely controlled aggression. Whatever was coming had awakened something primal in the animal, something that recognized threats older than rifles or knives. "We need to move," Gideon said, shouldering his pack. The brass compass in his hand pointed steadily north, but he noticed that its needle trembled slightly, as if some force was trying to pull it off true. "North to the sacred ground," Martha agreed. "It's the only place where we might be able to end this." They set off deeper into the mountains, following game trails that wound between ancient pines and over ridges where the wind carried whispers in languages Gideon didn't recognize. Behind them, the wrongness followed like a tide of shadows, and ahead lay sacred ground where the dead were supposed to rest in peace. Gideon gripped his father's compass tighter and tried not to think about what happened to men who disturbed the peace of the dead. They made camp that evening in a sheltered hollow between two granite outcroppings, the kind of natural fortress that offered protection from wind and prying eyes. Martha had grown increasingly quiet as the day wore on, and now she sat by their small fire, clutching a leather-bound journal that she'd pulled from her pack along. "With the cursed pouch, my grandmother's diary," she explained when she noticed Gideon watching. The journal was old, its pages yellowed with age and filled with writing in two different hands, English letters mixed with symbols that looked like they belonged to some older alphabet. She wrote down everything she remembered about the soul catcher, all the warnings that got passed down through the generations. Echo lay at the edge of their firelight, his eyes reflecting the flames as he kept watch over the darkness beyond. The wolf had grown more agitated as evening approached, occasionally lifting his muzzle to test the wind for scents that made him growl low in his throat. "What kind of warnings?" Gideon asked. Though part of him wasn't sure he wanted to know, Martha opened the journal carefully, treating its fragile pages like holy relics. "Listen to this. It's from the entry she made after my great-grandmother died." She cleared her throat and began to read in a voice that carried the weight of old grief. "The soul catcher is not a tool for the living to command. It is a sacred trust, meant to guide spirits home when their earthly journey ends. But in the wrong hands, at the proper time and place, it can tear holes in the fabric between worlds. The ancestors warned that such holes, once opened, cannot easily be closed." The fire popped, sending sparks into the night sky where they mingled with early stars. Gideon found himself thinking about holes in the world, and what might crawl through them if given the chance. "There's more," Martha continued, flipping through pages covered in her grandmother's careful handwriting. "Brother Mordecai came to the reservation again, asking about the old ways, the burial customs. He offered money, more money than our people have ever seen, but the elders turned him away. They say his shadow falls wrong, that dogs won't eat from his hand, and children cry when he passes. The soul catcher must never fall into such hands. Better to destroy it than see it misused." "But you're not planning to destroy it," Gideon observed. "I can't. According to the diary, destroying it would release all the souls it's helped guide over the years. Hundreds of spirits trapped between worlds, neither living nor properly dead. Martha's fingers traced the journal's worn edges. The only safe way to end its power is to return it to sacred ground and perform the proper burial rites. Let the ancestors reclaim what was always theirs. The wind shifted, carrying with it a scent that made Echo bare his teeth. Not quite death, not quite decay, but something wrong that seemed to seep into the very air around them. Gideon recognized the smell from his military days, the battlefield stench that clung to places where too many men had died badly. "They're close," Martha whispered, closing the journal and holding it against her chest like armor. How close? Before she could answer, they heard it, the sound of horses moving through the forest, but moving wrong. The hoofbeats came in rhythm that didn't match any living animal. Too slow and too deliberate, like a funeral march played in 4/4 time. Echo rose to his feet, every muscle in his body coiled for violence. But instead of facing outward toward the approaching threat, the wolf turned to stare at the soul catcher's pouch, where it lay beside Martha's bedroll. His lips pulled back from his teeth, and a whine escaped that sounded almost like speech. "The soul catcher," Martha said, her voice tight with understanding. "It's calling to them, or they're calling to it. The closer they get, the stronger the connection becomes." Gideon checked his rifle, though bullets seemed inadequate against men who'd been touched by dark power, as Martha had described them. Still, lead and steel were the tools he understood, and understanding was a comfort when facing the impossible. "Tell me about Thomas's time with them," he said, keeping his voice low. "What did he learn that might help us?" Martha was quiet for so long that Gideon wondered if she'd heard the question. When she finally spoke, her words came slowly, as if each one cost her something. "He told me that Brother Mordecai wasn't always their leader. 20 years ago, maybe more, he was just another drifter looking for easy money and easier answers. But he found something in the desert, some artifact or tome or place of power that changed him, made him into something else." She paused, listening to the approaching hoofbeats. "Thomas said that Mordecai's eyes went black during the dark moon, and that he could speak with voices that belonged to dead men. The other brothers followed him because they were afraid not to, and because he promised them that death would have no dominion over the faithful. And he believed that?" "Thomas, no, not anymore. Near the end, he told me that Mordecai had made some kind of bargain, traded his humanity for power over death itself. But bargains like that always have a price, and the price was never what the bargainer expected." The hoofbeats stopped. In the sudden silence, Gideon could hear his own heartbeat and Martha's shallow breathing and Echo's barely suppressed growling. But underneath those familiar sounds was something else, whispers in the wind, words in a language that predated English or Spanish or any tongue meant for living throats. "They're here," Martha breathed. A voice called out from the darkness beyond their fire, cultured and pleasant like a preacher addressing his congregation. "Martha Crenshaw, you've led us quite a chase, my dear. But all journeys must end, and yours ends here, Brother Mordecai." Even without seeing him, Gideon knew this was the cult's leader. The voice carried authority and madness in equal measure, the tone of a man who'd convinced himself that his sins were actually virtues. "I have what you seek," the voice continued. "Your husband's life. His soul, anyway, trapped in the space between death and resurrection. Bring me the soul catcher, and Thomas lives again. Refuse, and he suffers eternally in the darkness between worlds." Martha's face went white in the firelight. Her hand moved instinctively toward the pouch, then stopped as if she touched something burning. "He's lying," Gideon said quietly. "Maybe, but what if he isn't?" The pain in her voice was raw, immediate. "What if Thomas is out there somewhere, waiting for me to save him?" Echo's growl deepened, and his hackles rose until he looked more wolf than dog. The animal was staring into the darkness where Mordecai's voice had originated, but his posture suggested he was seeing something that Gideon's human eyes couldn't detect. "Think about what Thomas died for," Gideon said. "What he'd want you to do now." Martha nodded slowly, though tears tracked down her cheeks. When she spoke, her voice carried the strength that had gotten her this far. "My husband is dead," she called out to the darkness. And the soul catcher goes to sacred ground where it belongs. The laughter that answered her was like breaking glass. Dawn found them at an abandoned trading post called Rattlesnake Station, though Gideon couldn't shake the feeling that they'd been guided there rather than choosing the route themselves. They'd slipped away from their camp during the darkest hour before sunrise, while Brother Mordecai's laughter still echoed among the peaks. But every step of their flight had felt predetermined, like pieces moving across a chessboard according to rules he didn't understand. The trading post squatted in a natural clearing surrounded by dead timber, its log walls still solid despite years of abandonment. Someone had built it to last through harsh winters and hostile territory, but it had the feel of a place where hope had come to die. Echo refused to approach the building directly, circling it at a distance with his hackles raised. "Something's wrong here," Martha said, though she followed Gideon toward the heavy wooden door. The soul catcher's pouch seemed to pulse against her side with each step, and her grandmother's journal felt heavier in her pack than it had the night before. The door hung open on leather hinges, revealing an interior that should have been empty but wasn't. Tables and chairs remained arranged as if customers might arrive at any moment, and the bar still held bottles of whiskey that caught the morning light like amber jewels. But everything was covered in a fine layer of dust that hadn't been disturbed by wind or weather, the kind of stillness that spoke of supernatural. Preservation rather than natural. Abandonment, Gideon's boots echoed on the plank floor as he approached the bar, where a leather-bound guest registry lay open to pages covered in names and dates. Most of the entries were unremarkable, travelers' signatures and brief notes about weather or road conditions. But the last few entries made his blood run cold. Brother Ezekiel, October 15th, in service to the Order of the Bone, he read aloud. Brother Nahum, same date, seeking sacred ground. Brother Mordecai, his voice caught. October 20th, the faithful gather for the great work. Death shall have no dominion. Martha leaned over his shoulder to read the dates, her face pale in the dusty light filtering through broken windows. October 20th was 3 days ago. They've been here recently, planning something. More than planning. Gideon flipped back through the registry's pages, finding similar entries dating back months. They've been using this place as a base of operations. Look at this. Supply lists, scouting reports, ritual preparations. The registry told a story, written in careful handwriting and cryptic symbols. The Brothers of the Bone had been methodically preparing for something they called the Great Opening, gathering artifacts and followers from across the territories. Martha's soul catcher wasn't their only prize. They'd been collecting sacred objects from a dozen different tribes, building what looked like a supernatural arsenal. Echo's warning bark brought Gideon's head up sharply. The wolf stood at the trading post's front window, staring out at the forest, with every muscle tensed for flight or fight. When Gideon joined him at the window, he saw what had spooked the animal. Bodies hung from the trees at the clearing's edge. They weren't fresh. The mountain air had mummified them rather than letting them rot, but their position suggested they'd died badly. Men and women both, strung up with their arms spread wide like grotesque scarecrows. Their clothes marked them as travelers, people who'd had the misfortune to stumble across the brothers' operations. "Jesus," Martha whispered, following his gaze. "How many?" Gideon counted silently. "Dozen, maybe more. They're arranged in a pattern, some kind of ritual circle around the clearing." He studied the positioning more carefully, noting how the bodies faced inward toward the trading post. "This whole place is set up like a trap, or a summoning circle. For what?" Before he could answer, the temperature in the trading post dropped 20 degrees in as many seconds. Their breath began to fog, and frost formed on the inside of the windows, despite the warm October morning outside. The whiskey bottles on the bar began to vibrate, creating a low humming that seemed to come from the earth itself. Martha grabbed the soul catcher's pouch through her jacket, and the humming intensified until it felt like standing inside a church bell. "It's responding to something," she said through gritted teeth. "Something close." Echo's bark turned into a howl that spoke of primal terror, and suddenly the trading post was full of voices. Not the whispers they'd heard the night before, but clear speech in languages both familiar and strange. English mixed with Spanish, mixed with tongues that predated European settlement by centuries. "The sacred ground calls to its own," said a woman's voice that might have been Martha's grandmother. "The soul catcher knows its home. Blood has been spilled in preparation," added a man's voice that carried the authority of old chiefs and medicine men. "The brothers seek to open what should remain closed." "Thomas," Martha breathed. And Gideon heard it too, her husband's voice among the others, speaking words of warning and love. "Martha, my heart, you must not let them complete the ritual. The soul catcher is the key, but you are the lock. Without your willing participation, their power is incomplete." The voices faded as quickly as they'd come, leaving behind only the normal sounds of mourning in the mountains. But the trading post remained cold, and the soul catcher continued to pulse against Martha's side like a second heartbeat. "Did you hear?" Martha started to ask. "Thomas." "Yeah, I heard him." Gideon moved away from the window, uncomfortable with how easily he was accepting supernatural conversations. "He said you were the lock. What did he mean?" "I don't know. The diary mentions something about bloodline connections, about how certain artifacts can only be properly used by descendants of their makers, but—" She stopped suddenly, her face going white. "Oh God, that's why they let me escape. That's why they're herding us towards sacred ground instead of just killing us and taking the soul catcher. They need you alive. They need me willing. The ritual requires a blood descendant of the original maker to activate the soul catcher's full power. Without me, it's just an old pouch full of bones and hair. With me, with you, they can tear open the boundary between life and death permanently." Martha sank into one of the trading post's chairs, the weight of understanding finally settling on her shoulders. "Thomas didn't just die protecting the soul catcher. He died trying to keep me away from it. Because as long as I'm alive and the soul catcher exists, the brothers have everything they need to complete their ritual. Outside, Echo's howling took on a different quality, not warning now, but mourning, as if the wolf understood that their enemies had already won the most important victory, and everything that followed would just be aftermath. Gideon checked his rifle and moved to bar the trading post's door, though he suspected that wooden planks wouldn't stop men who commanded the voices of the dead. "Then we better make sure they don't get the chance to use what they have." The frost on the windows began to melt, but the cold in Gideon's bones remained. They left the trading post as the sun reached its zenith, but not before Gideon had cut down the bodies from the trees and given them what burial he could manage in the rocky soil. Martha had watched him work in silence, and when he finished, she'd said a prayer in the Crow language that her great-grandmother had taught her. The words felt right in this place of death, even if Gideon couldn't understand them. Echo wore a leather collar that had belonged to another life, another world where little girls made gifts for their father's wolf companion. Emma Pike had been 8 years old when she'd carefully tooled the leather with flowers and birds, her small hands working the needle with the patience that came naturally to children who lived in the vast spaces of the frontier. Gideon touched the collar now as they climbed toward the high passes, remembering the pride in his daughter's eyes when she'd presented it to Echo that last Christmas they'd all been together. "She was beautiful," Martha said, noticing his gesture. They'd been walking in companionable silence for the better part of an hour, following game trails that wound through stands of aspen and pine. "Your daughter? I can see her in the way you move, the way you check over your shoulder to make sure. Everyone's keeping up," Gideon hadn't realized. He was doing that, the automatic patrol leader's gesture that had kept his men alive, through 2 years of fighting in hostile territory. Some habits died hard, and some never died at all. Emma would have been 10 now, he said, surprised by how easily the words came. 3 years of isolation had made him forget the comfort of sharing grief with someone who understood loss. She wanted to be a doctor when she grew up, said she was going to heal all the hurt things in the world. And Sarah was the strongest person I ever met. Came west with her parents when she was 16, survived 2 Indian raids and a winter that killed half the settlement. then married a soldier who spent more time away than home. He paused to check their back trail, though he knew the brothers weren't following, not yet. She used to say that strength wasn't about never being afraid. It was about being afraid and doing what needed to be done anyway. Martha shifted the soul catcher's pouch to a more comfortable position, though Gideon noticed she never let it rest easy. The artifact had been growing heavier as they climbed toward the sacred burial ground, as if it was remembering its true weight after years of being diminished by distance from its proper home. Thomas would have liked her, Martha said. He always said that courage was just fear that had found its purpose. They crested a ridge that offered a view of the country ahead, rolling hills covered in sage and scattered timber, with the sacred burial ground somewhere in the distance beyond the next range of peaks. But what caught Gideon's attention wasn't the terrain, it was Echo's behavior. The wolf had stopped dead in the middle of the trail, his ears flattened against his head and his tail tucked between his legs. He was staring not ahead toward their destination, but back the way they'd come. And the whine escaping his throat was like nothing Gideon had ever heard from him, high and desperate, almost human in its anguish. "What is it, boy?" Gideon knelt beside the wolf, following his gaze back down the mountain. At first he saw nothing unusual, just the familiar landscape of granite and pine that had been their world for the past 2 days. But then the shadows began to move wrong, flowing uphill against the angle of the sun like dark water defying gravity. "The collar," Martha whispered, and Gideon felt his blood turn to ice water. Echo's leather collar, Emma's gift, was glowing with a soft blue light that pulsed in rhythm with the soul catcher's own emanations. But more than that, images were forming in the leather's tooled surface. Faces that Gideon recognized despite the years and the impossible circumstances. Sarah's face, exactly as she'd looked on their wedding day. Emma's, bright with the joy that had defined her short life. And others, the men from his unit who died in the canyon flash flood, their features unmarked by the violence that had claimed them. "They're here," Martha said, her voice tight with understanding. "All of them. The soul catcher is calling to every spirit that has unfinished business with us. That's not possible. Nothing about this is possible. But look around you, really look." Gideon did, and saw that the entire mountainside had become something from a fever dream. The pine trees swayed without wind, their needles falling upward into a sky that held stars despite the bright afternoon sun. Animals moved through the forest, deer and elk and smaller creatures, but they cast no shadows and left no tracks. And their eyes held the patient sorrow of the long dead. "The boundary between worlds is thinning," Martha continued. "The closer we get to sacred ground, the more the soul catcher remembers its true purpose. But the brothers have corrupted that purpose, twisted it into something it was never meant to be." Echo's collar pulsed brighter, and suddenly Emma's voice filled the air around them, clear as if she were standing right there. "Papa, you have to let us go." Gideon spun around, searching for the source of the voice, but saw only Martha's sympathetic face and the impossible landscape that surrounded them. "Emma, we can't rest while you carry so much pain." "Papa, we've been waiting for you to forgive yourself. But the bad men want to use our waiting for terrible things." Sarah's voice joined their daughter's, carrying the same gentle strength that had sustained Gideon through years of war and hardship. "My love, you have to choose. Hold on to us and give the brothers what they need, or let us go and save everyone else." The voices faded, but Echo's collar continued to glow, and Gideon understood with crystal clarity what Martha had meant about being the lock. The soul catcher didn't just hold the spirits of Martha's ancestors, it was connected to every soul that had unfinished business with its bearer. His wife and daughter weren't trapped in the artifact, but their spirits couldn't find peace while he held on to guilt that bound them to the living world. "That's why they need you alive," he said to Martha. "And that's why they've been content to herd us towards sacred ground instead of forcing a confrontation. They know that the closer we get, the stronger the pull becomes. The harder it gets to resist using the soul catcher for our own purposes, to bring back the ones we've lost, to ease our own pain, no matter what it costs everyone else. Martha nodded slowly, tears tracking down her cheeks as she looked at the soul catcher's pouch. Thomas tried to warn me about this, about how love could become the deadliest trap of all. Around them, the spirit animals continued their silent procession, and the stars grew brighter in the impossible sky. Sacred ground was still a day's travel ahead, but Gideon was beginning to understand that the real journey had nothing to do with distance. It had to do with learning when to hold on and when to let go. The sacred burial ground lay in a natural amphitheater carved into the mountainside, its ancient stone markers arranged in patterns that spoke of ceremonies older than written history. But what stopped Gideon cold wasn't the site's obvious power. It was the figure kneeling among the burial stones, very much alive and wearing the face of a dead man. Thomas Crenshaw looked exactly as Martha had described him, tall and lean with prematurely grey hair and eyes the colour of winter sky. He knelt beside a carefully arranged circle of artifacts, his hands moving in precise gestures as he prepared what was unmistakably a ritual space. When he looked up at their approach, his smile held genuine warmth mixed with deep regret. "Hello, Martha. I was wondering when you'd arrive." Martha's face went through a dozen expressions in as many seconds: shock, joy, disbelief, and finally a terrible understanding that made her reach for the pistol at her belt. "You're dead. I watched you die. You watched me choose a different kind of death," Thomas corrected gently. He rose from his work, brushing dust from his knees with movements that seemed completely normal, completely human. "Brother Mordecai offered me a bargain 6 months ago. My life in exchange for leading you here to this place. At the proper time." Echo had gone completely still beside Gideon, not growling or whining, but simply watching with the patient attention of a predator calculating distances. The wolf's silence was somehow more unnerving than his earlier agitation. "The arrows," Martha said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The blood, the way you died in my arms, all real. Death was necessary to complete the transformation, to make me into something that could serve as an anchor between the living world and the realm of spirits." Thomas gestured to the ritual circle around him, and Gideon saw that it wasn't just artifacts arranged there. It was bones, human bones arranged in patterns that hurt to look at directly. "I died for you, Martha, but I also died for this." Gideon felt pieces clicking into place with the cold precision of a rifle's action. The soul catcher wasn't the prize. She was. "Oh, the soul catcher is essential," Thomas agreed. "But you're right, Martha is the true prize. A direct descendant of the original maker, carrying 4 generations of spiritual connection in her bloodline. Combined with the soul catcher and the proper ritual space, she can open a permanent doorway between life and death." Martha's pistol was in her hand now, though she hadn't raised it yet. "And you've been planning this for 6 months. The whole time we were running, you were already here setting the trap. I've been here for 3 days preparing the site. The brothers you've been fleeing, they're real enough and dangerous enough. But they were never meant to catch you. They were meant to drive you here to this place at the moment when the boundary between worlds is thinnest." "The winter solstice," Gideon said. "Tonight, actually. The solstice moon rises in 4 hours, and the ritual must begin at moonrise to be properly effective." Thomas's expression remained calm, almost conversational, as if he were discussing the weather rather than cosmic blasphemy. "I know how this must look to both of you, how it must feel. But you have to understand, this is bigger than any of our individual desires or fears." From inside his jacket, Thomas pulled an object that made the soul catcher's pouch pulse with answering energy. It was a medal, bronze with a blue ribbon, and Gideon recognized it with a shock that felt like a physical blow. A Congressional Medal of Honor. His Congressional Medal of Honor. The one he'd hidden away after Sarah and Emma's deaths, because it represented everything he'd lost faith in. Duty, honor, the idea that individual sacrifice could serve a greater good. Where did you get that? From your cabin after Martha collapsed nearby? You're Captain Gideon Pike, formerly of the Colorado Volunteers. The ghost of Canyon Creek. They called you after you held off 300 Apache warriors with just 40 men. Thomas turned the medal over in his hands, and Gideon could see his own name engraved on the back. A genuine war hero, though you've spent the last 3 years trying to convince yourself otherwise. The world seemed to tilt sideways as implications cascaded through Gideon's mind. You've been planning this longer than 6 months, 2 years. Ever since Brother Mordecai learned about Martha's bloodline and began searching for the proper catalyst, someone whose connection to the spirit world was strong enough to anchor the ritual, but whose guilt and grief made them vulnerable to manipulation. Thomas's smile held genuine admiration. A man carrying the souls of everyone he'd failed to save. A man whose wife and daughter couldn't find peace because his guilt kept calling them back. Echo's collar pulsed brighter, and Emma's voice whispered through the evening air, "Papa, he's telling the truth." About the guilt, about us. We've been trying to cross over for 3 years, but we can't leave while you're still punishing yourself. Sarah's voice joined their daughter's. Let us go, my love. Let us rest. Don't let our deaths become the key to everyone else's damnation. Martha had raised her pistol now, though her hands shook with emotion rather than fear. You used me. Used my love for you to— I saved you, Thomas interrupted. Do you think Brother Mordecai would have been gentle in convincing you to cooperate? This way, you came willingly, driven by love rather than torture. This way, you have a choice. What choice? Thomas gestured to the ritual circle, where the winter moon was beginning to cast shadows despite still being below the horizon. Help me complete the great work. Open the doorway between life and death permanently, and everyone we've lost can return. Your great-grandmother, my fellow brothers who died in service to the cause, Captain Pike's wife and daughter, all of them, restored to life and freed from the cold realm of the dead, and the price. The boundary between life and death disappears forever. Death becomes merely another country to visit, rather than a final destination. Imagine it, Martha, a world where loss is temporary, where grief is just a brief interruption, rather than a lifelong sentence. Gideon found his voice, though it came out rough with emotion. A world where nothing has meaning because nothing has consequences. Where the natural order breaks down, because every ending can be undone. You say that as if the natural order has been kind to any of us, Thomas replied. Has it been kind to you, Captain, losing your family to disease while you fought for strangers? Has it been kind to Martha watching her husband die for a cause she never understood? The medal in Thomas's hand pulsed with the same blue light as Echo's collar and the soul catcher's pouch. 3 artifacts, 3 connections to the spirit world. 3 anchors for a ritual that would reshape reality itself. The choice is yours, Thomas continued. Both of yours. Help me complete the ritual, and death loses its sting forever. Refuse, and Brother Mordecai arrives within the hour with methods of persuasion that are considerably less pleasant than conversation. Martha looked at Gideon, her eyes wide with the terrible weight of decision. Around them, the burial ground hummed with power as the hidden moon approached its zenith, and the spirits of the dead pressed close to the boundary between worlds. What do we do? She whispered. Gideon touched Echo's glowing collar, feeling Emma's love and Sarah's strength flowing through the leather that connected him to everything he'd lost. For 3 years, he'd been haunted by the question of what he would sacrifice to have them back. Now he was about to find out if love was strong enough to choose loss over damnation. We do what they would want us to do, he said quietly. We let them go. Thomas's face hardened as he realized he'd miscalculated. He was hoping it wouldn't come to this. The ritual circle flared to life around him, and the real battle began. The stone markers that ringed the sacred burial ground began to glow with the same blue light that emanated from Echo's collar and Gideon's medal. As Thomas raised his hands to begin the ritual, the very air seemed to thicken with spiritual energy that made breathing difficult and thinking even harder. This was power older than the mountains themselves, accumulated over centuries of burial ceremonies and prayers for the peaceful rest of the dead. Martha's pistol tracked Thomas as he moved between the arranged artifacts, but her hand trembled with more than anger. The soul-catcher's pouch at her side pulsed in rhythm with the stone markers, and Gideon could see the conflict written across her face: love warring with duty, grief wrestling with wisdom. "You don't have to do this," Thomas said, as he placed Gideon's medal at the center of the ritual circle. "I can feel your pain, Martha, your longing. The soul catcher connects us now. I know how much you want me back, how much Captain Pike wants his family restored." "That's the problem," Gideon replied, checking the load in his rifle. "Want and need aren't the same thing." Echo had positioned himself at the edge of the ritual circle, his body tense with supernatural awareness. The wolf's collar blazed brighter as the hidden moon climbed toward zenith, and images continued to flicker across its surface. Emma's face, Sarah's smile, moments from a life that seemed impossibly distant now. Around them, the burial ground was filling with presences that existed just beyond the edge of vision. Gideon caught glimpses of movement in his peripheral vision, shadows that held human shapes, whispers in languages that predated European settlement by millennia. The ancestors were watching, waiting to see if their sacred ground would become a doorway to damnation. "The brothers should be here by now," Martha said, her voice tight with tension. "Where are they?" Thomas smiled without warmth as he began arranging the human bones in more complex patterns. Brother Mordecai and his followers served their purpose. They drove you here, created the proper atmosphere of fear and desperation, made you willing to trust the lesser evil over the greater one. But they were never truly necessary to the ritual itself. You killed them. I absorbed them. Their spiritual energy, their connections to the realm of the dead, their accumulated power over 3 decades of serving darkness. Thomas's eyes reflected the blue light of the stone markers, and Gideon realized they held depths that didn't belong in any living man's gaze. "Death is just another form of energy, Captain, and energy can neither be created nor destroyed, only transformed." The implications of that statement hit Gideon like a physical blow. "You're not just planning to open a doorway between life and death. You're planning to become something that controls both. Someone has to. The natural order you're so eager to defend. It's broken, Captain, full of arbitrary suffering, meaningless loss, pain without purpose. I can fix that. Make death voluntary rather than inevitable. Make loss temporary rather than permanent." Thomas gestured to the ritual circle, where the arranged bones were beginning to levitate, spinning slowly in patterns that hurt to watch directly. "All I need is Martha's willing participation to activate the soul catcher's full power, and your medal to anchor the spiritual energy of your military service. And if we refuse, then I take what I need by force, though the ritual will be considerably more painful for everyone involved." Martha lowered her pistol, but not in surrender. Her face had taken on the same determined expression Gideon had seen when she'd first begged him not to touch the soul catcher. "There's a third option." She pulled the leather pouch from inside her jacket, holding it carefully as if it contained live coals. The artifact pulsed with increasing intensity as the moon approached its zenith, and the air around it began to shimmer with heat distortion despite the cold mountain night. "I destroy it," she said simply. "Release all the souls it contains. Break the connection between worlds. Make your ritual impossible." Thomas's composure cracked for the first time since they'd arrived. "You can't. The soul catcher is tied to your bloodline. Destroying it would kill you instantly." "Maybe, but it would also free every spirit trapped between worlds, including yours." Martha's smile held the same gentle strength Gideon remembered from Sarah. "Thomas, you died 6 months ago. What's walking around in your body isn't my husband. It's something that wears his face and speaks with his voice, but it's not him. I am him. I have all his memories, all his feelings for you. You have his echo, his shadow. But Thomas, the real Thomas, would never ask me to damn the world to ease his own pain." The floating bones spun faster, and the stone markers pulsed like massive heartbeats. Around the burial ground's perimeter, the ghostly presences were becoming clearer. Native warriors in traditional dress, Women and children from settlements long forgotten, soldiers from wars that had ended decades ago, all waiting, all watching, all depending on the choices made by three living people in a circle of power older than recorded history. Echo's collar flared suddenly, and Emma's voice filled the air with crystalline clarity. "Papa, we have to go now. The moon is almost ready, and if we don't cross over soon, we'll be trapped here when the doorway opens." Sarah's voice joined their daughter's, urgent with love and fear. "My heart, you have to choose. Save us by letting us go, or lose us forever by trying to hold on." Gideon felt tears on his cheeks as he looked at the glowing collar, seeing his family's faces flickering in the tooled leather. 3 years of guilt, 3 years of self-imposed exile, 3 years of punishing himself for failing to save them. And now he had to fail them again, had to choose their peace over his own desperate need to make amends. "I'm sorry," he whispered to the collar, to the memories, to the love that had sustained and tormented him in equal measure. "I'm so sorry I wasn't there when you needed me." "You're here now, when we need you most," Emma replied, her voice already growing fainter as the spiritual connection began to fade. "That's what matters, Papa. That's what love really means." The light in Echo's collar began to dim as the spirits it contained prepared to cross over into whatever realm awaited beyond the boundary of death. But as it faded, Gideon felt something unexpected, not loss but release. Not emptiness, but the possibility of being filled with something new. Martha raised the soul catcher above her head, its leather surface smoking in her grip. "Thomas, I loved you. I'll always love the man you were. But I won't let what you've become destroy everything we held sacred. Martha, please, goodbye, my heart. Find peace in whatever comes next." She began to tear the soul catcher's leather, and Thomas screamed with a sound that didn't come from any human throat. The ritual circle collapsed as the bones crashed to the ground, and the stone markers flickered like candles in a hurricane. But the moon had reached its zenith, and the boundary between worlds had grown thin enough for other things to take notice of the power being unleashed. As the soul catcher began to disintegrate in Martha's hands, Gideon realized that their battle with Thomas might have been just the opening act. Something vast and hungry was stirring in the spaces between life and death, drawn by the massive release of spiritual energy, something that made Brother Mordecai and his cult look like children playing with matches. The real enemy was about to reveal itself, and Gideon suspected that all their choices, right and wrong, noble and selfish, might not be enough to stop what was coming. Above them, the winter solstice moon blazed with cold fire, and the sacred burial ground became a battlefield where the living and the dead would make their final stand. The moment Martha tore the soul catcher's leather, reality came apart at the seams. What emerged from the disintegrating pouch wasn't the gentle release of trapped spirits that Gideon had expected, but a howling maelstrom of raw spiritual energy that turned the sacred burial ground into something from a nightmare. The carefully arranged stone markers cracked and shifted, their ancient patterns disrupted by forces they were never meant to contain. The winter moon above them flickered like a dying candle as something vast and hungry pressed against the boundary between worlds. Thomas screamed again, but now his voice carried harmonics that belonged to dozens of different throats, all the brothers he'd absorbed, all the spirits he'd bound to his will, all crying out as their anchor in the living world began to dissolve. His form wavered between human and something else, something that cast shadows in directions where no light fell. Gideon raised his father's hunting rifle, the weapon that had fed his family through 3 generations of hard living in unforgiving country. The Winchester felt solid and real in his hands, a connection to simpler times when enemies were flesh and blood and could be stopped with lead and steel. But as he took aim at the thing that wore Thomas Crenshaw's face, he wondered if any earthly weapon could affect something that existed between life and death. "The rifle won't stop him," Martha said, her voice strained with the effort of maintaining her grip on the disintegrating soul catcher. Spiritual energy poured from her hands like liquid light, and her skin was beginning to smoke from the contact. "He's already dead. Has been for months. Then what do we—" Echo's howl cut through the chaos, but it wasn't the wolf's voice alone. The sound carried Emma's laughter and Sarah's singing, the voices of Gideon's lost unit, and underneath it all, the deep harmonies of the land itself, mountains and streams and sky, all adding their strength to the wolf's supernatural cry. The hunting rifle in Gideon's hands began to glow with the same blue light that emanated from Echo's collar. Not the cold illumination of the soul catcher's power, but something warmer, more alive. The weapon had been blessed by 3 generations of honest use, fed families through harsh winters, protected homes from threats both natural and human. It carried its own form of sacred power, the accumulated strength of men who'd used it to serve something larger than themselves. The rifle's not just a weapon, he realized aloud. It's a focus, a way to channel. Thomas lunged at Martha before Gideon could finish the thought, moving with inhuman speed across the disrupted ritual circle. But Echo was faster, the wolf launching himself between Martha and her undead husband, with teeth bared and supernatural fire blazing in his eyes. The collision sent both figures tumbling across the broken stones, Thomas's borrowed flesh meeting Echo's spirit-enhanced form in a clash that sent shockwaves through the fabric of reality itself. Where they struck the ground, flowers bloomed instantly, not normal mountain wildflowers, but blossoms of pure light that flickered between existence and memory. Martha staggered backward, still clutching the remains of the soul catcher as more spirits poured from its disintegrating form. Not just her ancestors now, but hundreds of souls that had been trapped in the artifact over the generations. Warriors and medicine men, mothers and children, all the dead who'd been helped to find peace through the proper ceremonies. They swirled around the burial ground like a luminous tornado, their combined voices rising in songs that predated human language. "They're not crossing over," Martha shouted over the spiritual hurricane. "Something's holding them here." The thing that had been Thomas rose from its struggle with Echo, the wolf's supernatural flames having burned away the last pretense of human form. What stood in the center of the burial ground now was darkness given shape, a void in the world that spoke with the voices of everyone it had consumed. "Death is not the end," it said with Brother Mordecai's authority and Thomas Crenshaw's love and the hunger of something far older than both. Death is the beginning, the first step into true power. It raised one shadow-wrapped hand toward the flickering moon, and Gideon felt the temperature drop another 20 degrees. Frost formed on his rifle barrel, and his breath came out in clouds that sparkled with unnatural light. The soul catcher was never the real prize, the darkness continued. It was the key. The way to unlock what has always been here, waiting beneath the sacred ground. The stone markers around the burial ground began to sink into the earth, revealing what lay beneath, not soil and rock, but a vast hollow space filled with older bones than any that belonged to human graves. Dragon bones, if dragons had ever existed, the remains of creatures that had ruled the earth before men, learned to make fire and tell stories about gods, who cared whether mortals lived or died. "The first spirits," Martha whispered, understanding flooding her face with terrible clarity. "The ones who came before everything else. The ancestors spoke of them in the oldest stories, spirits so powerful that death itself was just another country they could visit. The darkness that had been Thomas smiled with teeth made of starlight and shadow. And now they're waking up. Above them, the winter moon went out completely, leaving only the glow of the freed spirits to hold back absolute darkness. In the darkness, left by the extinguished moon, the battle for the sacred burial ground became something beyond mortal comprehension. The ancient spirits rising from beneath the stone markers weren't evil in any human sense. They were simply so old and powerful that mortal concepts of right and wrong had no meaning for them. They were the first children of creation, beings that had existed when the boundary between life and death was just a suggestion rather than a law. Gideon fired his father's hunting rifle at the darkness that had been Thomas, and the blessed bullet struck true. But instead of destroying the shadow creature, the rifle's power seemed to anchor it somehow, forcing it back into a more solid form. Thomas Crenshaw's face reformed from the swirling darkness, but now it was marked with the accumulated pain of everyone he'd consumed. "You can't kill what's already dead," the thing said, its voice carrying echoes of Brother Mordecai's fanaticism and something far older. "But you can free it." Martha understood first, her face lighting with desperate hope as she saw what Gideon's blessed weapon had accomplished. "The rifle doesn't destroy spirits, it anchors them, gives them form, makes them vulnerable to choice," Echo interrupted, speaking with a voice that was part wolf and part Emma Pike, and part something that belonged to the land itself. "The oldest law. Even the first spirits must choose between service and freedom, between power and peace." The wolf had grown during the battle, his form shifting between the familiar animal Gideon had known for 3 years and something primordial and magnificent, a guardian spirit that had watched over these mountains since before human feet walked their paths. The leather collar around his neck blazed with the accumulated love of a little girl who'd crafted it with her own hands, and that love had become a source of power greater than any dark magic. Around them, the freed spirits from Martha's soul. Catcher had formed a protective circle, their combined light holding back the rising darkness from beneath the burial ground. But Gideon could see they were weakening. Too many centuries of being trapped, too much spiritual energy expended in their sudden release. "We can't hold them much longer," one of the spirits said. Martha's great-grandmother, speaking in the crow language that somehow everyone present could understand. "The first spirits grow stronger with each moment that passes. Soon they will break free completely, and the boundary between life and death will cease to exist." The thing that wore Thomas's face laughed, a sound like breaking glass and distant thunder. "You think this is about conquest? About power? This is about completion. About finishing what was started when the first human drew breath and doomed the world to mortality." It gestured toward the growing cracks in the stone markers, where shapes that hurt to perceive directly were beginning to emerge. Not the familiar forms of human spirits, but geometries that existed in dimensions mortal eyes weren't meant to see. When the first spirits ruled, there was no death, because there was no time. No loss, because nothing ever truly ended. We're not destroying the world, we're restoring it to what it was meant to be. Martha stepped forward, the last fragments of the soul catcher still smoking in her hands. Her face was pale with exhaustion, but her eyes held the same determination that had carried her across hostile territory, with arrows in her back. "And what about choice?" she asked. "What about the right to grow old and die and find peace? What about letting children become adults, letting love deepen with time, letting wisdom come from experience? Illusions, distractions, the desperate attempts of mortals to find meaning in meaninglessness." "No," Gideon said, raising his rifle again. "They're what make us human." This time, when he fired, the bullet was joined by Echo's howl and Martha's prayer and the combined voices of all the spirits holding the circle. The blessed lead struck Thomas in the center of his chest, and instead of destroying him, it gave him back his human form completely, not the shadow creature he'd become, but the man Martha had married and loved for 15 years. For just a moment, Thomas Crenshaw's eyes were his own again, filled with the horror of understanding what he'd become and what he'd almost accomplished. "Martha," he whispered, "I'm sorry. I thought I was saving you, but I was—" "I know," she said gently. "I know, my heart, but now you can choose. You can let go." Thomas looked around the burial ground, at the ancient spirits stirring beneath the broken stones, at the protective circle of the freed dead, at the woman who'd loved him enough to destroy herself rather than let him damn the world. "The first spirits," he said, his voice growing fainter as the rifle's power held him in mortal form. "They're not evil, they're just empty. They've existed so long without growth or change that they've forgotten what it means to be alive." He turned toward the rising darkness, and when he spoke again, his voice carried the authority of someone who'd walked in both worlds and chosen which one deserved to endure. "I choose peace," he said simply. "I choose rest. I choose to let the dead stay dead and the living find their own way forward." The light that emanated from his words was brighter than the extinguished moon. Thomas Crenshaw's choice echoed across the sacred burial ground, like a bell tolling the end of an age. The light that poured from his words wasn't the cold illumination of supernatural power, but something warmer and infinitely more precious, the accumulated love of a man who'd learned the difference between existing and truly living, the ancient spirit stirring beneath. The broken stone markers paused in their emergence, their impossible forms wavering between the urge to reclaim the world and the growing understanding of what they'd lost during their eons of changeless existence. They'd been the first children of creation, but they'd never learned to grow beyond that first moment of being. They were eternal, but they weren't alive, not in any way that mattered. "He's right," one of them said, its voice like wind through mountain passes older than memory. "We have forgotten. In our hunger to undo death, we lost sight of what made life worth living." Martha knelt beside Thomas as his borrowed form began to fade, the rifle's anchoring power finally releasing him to whatever rest awaited beyond the boundary of death. She took his hand, feeling flesh that was already growing cold and insubstantial. "I love you," she whispered. "I'll always love the man you were. And I'll love you from wherever souls go when they finally let go of the world," he replied, his voice growing fainter with each word. "Take care of the sacred ground, Martha. Make sure the ancestors rest in peace." He was gone before she could answer, his form dissolving into motes of light that drifted upward like fireflies seeking the stars. But his passing seemed to give the ancient spirits permission to make their own choice about existence and eternity. One by one, they began to sink back beneath the burial ground, their vast forms folding in on themselves, until they were just memories sleeping in the earth. The last to go paused at the threshold between manifestation and rest, its attention fixed on Gideon with something like gratitude. "The rifle," it said. "Keep it. The world may have need of such blessings again." Then it too was gone, leaving only the familiar silence of the high mountains and the gentle light of stars that had finally become visible again as the winter moon resumed its journey across the night sky. Echo padded over to Gideon, his form settling back into that of an ordinary wolf, though his eyes still held depths that spoke of supernatural awareness. Emma's collar had stopped glowing, but the leather remained warm to the touch, not with otherworldly fire, but with the simple warmth of a daughter's love for her father. "Are they at peace now?" Gideon asked, touching the collar with fingers that trembled slightly. "Sarah and Emma, did they find what they were looking for?" "They found rest," Martha answered, though she was looking not at Echo, but at the place where Thomas had faded away. "All of them did. The dead were never meant to carry the burdens of the living, just as the living were never meant to bear the grief of the dead forever." Together, they began the work of restoring the sacred burial ground. It took the rest of the night, setting the stone markers back in their proper places, gathering the scattered bones from Thomas's broken ritual circle, saying prayers in languages both ancient and modern. By dawn, the site looked much as it had for centuries, a place where the dead could rest, undisturbed, and the living could come to remember. Without being consumed by loss, Martha carved a simple wooden cross from a piece of fallen pine and placed it at the spot where Thomas had made his final choice. She didn't mark it with his name. That belonged to the man he'd been in life, not the thing he'd become after death. Instead, she carved a single word in the Crow language, peace. "What now?" Gideon asked as they prepared to leave the sacred ground. The sun was climbing toward mid-morning, painting the mountains in shades of gold and crimson that spoke of winter giving way to the promise of spring. "Now I go back to the reservation," Martha said, shouldering the pack that no longer carried a cursed artifact. The elders will want to hear what happened here, and there are ceremonies that need to be performed to properly sanctify the burial ground." She paused, studying his face. "What about you?" Gideon looked down at Echo, who was watching him with the patient attention of a companion who understood that some journeys were ending while others were just beginning. The wolf's collar no longer carried voices from beyond the grave, but it still carried the love that had created it. And love, Gideon was learning, was something that could exist without demanding the impossible. "I think it's time I stopped hiding from the world," he said. "Sarah and Emma are at rest now, but there are other people who might need help. Other sacred places that might need protecting." Martha smiled, and for the first time since he'd found her dying in the desert, the expression reached her eyes. "The world can always use another guardian, especially one who knows the difference between serving the dead and serving the living." They parted ways at the base of the mountain, Martha heading south toward the Crow Reservation, and Gideon turning north toward whatever came next. Echo trotted beside him, occasionally looking back toward the sacred burial ground, but showing no inclination to return there. The wolf understood, as animals often do, that some chapters end so that others can begin. 3 months later, Gideon Pike opened a small general store in the frontier town of Cedar Falls, Montana. He served travelers and settlers with quiet competence, never speaking of his military service or the battles he'd fought against supernatural darkness. But those with eyes to see noticed that his wolf companion was uncommonly intelligent, and that the hunting rifle he kept behind the counter seemed to glow faintly in moonlight. Children weren't afraid of him, the way they often were of men who'd seen too much violence. Instead, they sensed something in his steady presence that spoke of safety and protection, the knowledge that some people stood ready to face the darkness so that others could sleep peacefully. And sometimes, on winter nights, when the wind carried voices that shouldn't exist, Gideon would take down his father's rifle and walk the boundaries of the town, with Echo beside him, a guardian keeping watch over the places where the living made their homes and the dead rested in honored peace.